Let us open our Bible to the book of Genesis. Genesis 36 and Genesis 37 we're going to cover. Genesis 36 and Genesis 37. Jealousy and worship. Jealousy and worship. If Christianity is the transformation of rebels into worshippers of God, then it is imperative for the Christian to know and understand what constituted biblical worship. One way, always consult Webster's dictionary for the precise meaning of worship, which is adore, idolize, esteem worthy, reverence, homage, and so on. Yet, truly defining worship proves more difficult because it is both an attitude and an act. The notion of worship is better defined by its practice. Worship during the patriarchal period was either an expression of praise and thanksgiving prompted by a theophany, which means the visible or auditory manifestation of God to human beings. So, as by a theophany or the act of obedience to some divine directive. For example, Abraham's obeying the command of God to sojourn in Canaan in Genesis 12, verse 4. Often, this expression of worship took the form of altar building in Genesis 33, verse 20, and sometimes combined prayer in Genesis 26, verse 25, or animal sacrifice in Genesis 31, verse 54, and Genesis 46, verse 1. Other expressions of patriarchal worship included the erection of stone pillars and the pouring of drink offerings in Genesis 26, verses 18 to 22, taking of vows in response to divine revelation in Genesis 28, verse 20, and Genesis 31, verse 13, ritual purification in Genesis 35, verse 2, the rite of circumcision as a sign of covenant obedience in Genesis 17, verses 9 to 14, and prayers of praise and thanksgiving in Genesis 12, verse 8, and Genesis 13, verse 4, of petition in Genesis 24, verse 12, and Genesis 25, verse 21, and intercession in Genesis 18, verses 22 to 33, and Genesis 20, verse 7. The book of Job confirms much of this assessment of pre-Mosaic religion among the Hebrews. The date of the literature of Job notwithstanding, the cultural and the historical background of Job's testing certainly reflect the patriarchal age. Like the Hebrew patriarch, Job is cast in the role of priest for his clan as the head of the family and offers sacrifices on their behalf in Job 1, verse 5. Confession and repentance in Genesis 42, verse 6, and petition and intercessory prayer in Genesis 6, verses 8 to 9, and Genesis 42, verses 8 to 9, were routine practices for Job as a blameless and upright man. Even the internal attitude of worship represented by the fear of God in Genesis 2, verse 3, and the lifestyle response of obedience as seen in Job's oath of clearance in in Genesis, in chapter 31 of the book of Job, parallel the patriarchal worship experience. Both the Old and New Testament admit the possibility of false worship, usually associated with idolatrous cults and gross misconduct in Deuteronomy 7 verses 3 to 6. For example, the Canaanites practiced ritual prostitution and infant sacrifice under the guise of worship to gods like Molech and Baal in Leviticus 18 verses 6 to 30, Leviticus 20 verses 1 to 5. While Paul found a little change, that he found that little had changed in the practice of idolatrous worship in Greek Corinth of the first century after Christ. In 1 Corinthians 6 verses 12 to 20, 1 Corinthians 10 verses 14 to 22. The psalmist recognized the folly of such false worship, noting that those who make idols will be like them in Psalm 115 verses 2 to 8. The prophets too warn against idolatry, a fatal attraction to the people of God in Ezekiel 14 verses 3 to 7. Sadly, the biting sarcasm of these divine messengers who decry the images with plastered eyes, the plastered eyes that had to be nailed to shelves to prevent them from toppling over, fell on deaf ears, as deaf as those of the idols they had fashioned, as it is said in Isaiah 41 verses 5 to 7. In the end, of course, these stumbling blocks between stumbling blocks of wood, stone, and precious metal overlay could not save Israel, as it is said in Isaiah 44 verse 17. The antidote Yahshua commanded in his discourse with the Samaritan woman remains the best preventive against false worship in John 4 verses 23 to 24. All true worshippers must worship God in, I quote, spirit and in truth, end of quote. That is, true worship takes place in the inside, in the heart, or spirit, in the heart or spirit of the worshipper, as it is said in Psalm 45 verse 1 and Psalm 103 verses 1 to 2. Worship pleasing to Yahweh must be unfeigned and transparent, offered with a humble and pure heart, as it is said in Psalm 24 verses 3 to 4 and Isaiah 66 verse 2. Now Genesis 36, Esau and his descendants. We are going to see all this in the light of worship. Did Esau and his descendants worship Yahweh? Verses 1 to 2. Esau, in open defiance, takes wives from the idolatrous Hittites and brings them to his tents within the camp, where they make life miserable for his parents, Isaac and Rebekah. And we see it in Genesis 26 verse 35. He also added a third wife from the descendants of Ishmael. Verses 6 to 8. The dividing of territory between Esau and Jacob described here is reminiscent of the episode between Abraham and Lot in Genesis 13 verses 1 to 13. There are two reasons for Esau's move. First, There isn't sufficient water and pasture for both flocks and herds. And second, Esau has finally come to accept that the promised land of Canaan is to be passed on to Jacob. Verses 8 to 43, Esau and his descendants are men of great secular political power. They are called dukes in verse 15, and kings in verse 31. These men reign as kings in Edom before any king reigns in Israel, while Esau's sons and grandsons become rulers. Jacob's sons remain lowly shepherds for generations, as we see it in Genesis 47 verse 3. Idolatry transmitted to Esau and his descendants through marital soul ties with Canaanite women can be seen through their social organization into familial kingdoms and duchies for the worship of hereditary kings and dukes. These kingdoms and duchies go hand in hand with all sorts of idolatrous worships. It is difficult in their type of society to worship Yahweh. The registers of this chapter show the faithfulness of Yahweh to his promise to Abraham. Esau is here called Edom, red. That name which kept up the remembrance of his selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. Esau continued the same profane despiser of heavenly things. In outward prosperity and honor, the children of the covenant are often behind, and those who are out of the covenant get the start. We may suppose it a trial to the faith of God's Israel to hear of the pomp and power of the kings of Edom, while the Israelites were bond slaves in Egypt. But those who look for great things from Yahweh must be content to wait for them. God's time is the best time. Mount Seir is called the land of their possession. Canaan was in this time only the land of promise. Seir was in the possession of the Edomites. The children of this world have their all in hand and nothing in hope, as it is said in Luke 16 verse 25. While the children of Yahweh have their all in hope and next to nothing in hand. But all things considered, it is beyond compare better to have Canaan in promise than Mount Seir in possession. Genesis 37. From Genesis 37 verse 1 to Genesis 50 verse 26, we may make this summary. While the last 14 chapters of Genesis include Jacob, the storyline focuses on Jacob's sons. And of his 12 sons, special interest is given to Joseph, who is mentioned twice as much as Jacob. This means a quarter of the book of Genesis is devoted to Joseph. Genesis 37 verses 1 to 4. Joseph is loved of Jacob, but hated by his brethren. Verse 2. Elsewhere, the word report is used in the negative sense of an untrue report. The same word is translated slander in Proverbs 10 verse 18. This may imply some exaggeration of inaccuracies of Joseph's part, which would have added fire to the rivalry between him and his brothers. Verse 3. Jacob's favoritism, signified by the colorful tunic he gives his favorite son, is no help. While it's not clear exactly what the tunic looked like, the idea that it is a coat of many colors comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The tunic sets Jacob apart as the favored one. Favoritism and rivalry have a long history in Jacob's family. Jacob's father Isaac preferred Esau. His mother Rebekah claimed Jacob as her favorite. And in Jacob's own family, his preference for Rachel set up resentment between not only Rachel and her sister, which his sister Leah, or also Jacob's wife, but probably between their children as well. In Jacob's history, we see something of grace. In Joseph's history, we see something of grace, who was first humble and then exalted. It also shows the lot of Christians who must, through many tribulations, enter into the kingdom. It is a history that has none like it for displaying the various workings of the human mind, both good and bad, and the singular providence of Yahweh in making use of them for fulfilling his purposes. Though Joseph was his father's darling, yet he was not bred up in idleness. Those who do not use their children to business and labor and hardship do not truly love them. Fondling children is with good reason called spoiling them. Those who are trained up to do nothing are likely to be good for nothing. But Jacob made known his love by dressing Joseph finer than the rest of his children. It is wrong for parents to make a difference between one child and another, unless there is great cause for it by the children's dutifulness or undutifulness. When parents make a difference, which is favoritism, children soon notice it, and it leads to quarrels in the family. Jacob's sons did what, when they were far from his eyes, which they would not have done at home with him. But Joseph gave his father an account of their ill conduct, that he might restrain them, not as a talebearer to sow discord, but as a faithful brother. Genesis 37 verses 5 to 11, Joseph's dreams. Verses 5 to 11. Joseph probably reveals part faith and part foolishness in sharing these dreams with his already contentious family. Verse 8. His brothers question, I quote, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" End of quote. Bring in the issue of worship and idolatry, human idolatry. Does Joseph think he will become king over them, before whom they will all bow down? Joseph's brothers reject him as a potential human idol in their family. Yahweh gave Joseph early the prospect of his advancement to support and comfort him under his long and grievous troubles. Observe, Joseph dreamed of his promotion, but he did not dream of his imprisonment. Thus, many young people, when setting out in the world, think of nothing but prosperity and pleasure and never dream of troubles. His brothers rightly interpreted the dream, though they regarded with hatred the interpretation of it. While they committed crimes in order to defeat it, they were themselves instruments of accomplishing it. Thus the Jews understand what Christ said of his kingdom, but determined that he should not reign over them, they consulted to put him to death, and by his crucifixions made way for the exaltation they designed to prevent. The idea of worshiping another individual, all the more so if the individual is of the same family, is the least acceptable in human minds because of the emotion of jealousy that hinders all acceptance. Genesis 37 verses 12 to 22. Jacob sends Joseph to visit his brethren. They conspire his death. Verses 12 to 17. Joseph is sent to check on his brothers. It is most uncommon for shepherds to lead their flocks many miles from home in search of pasture. Shechem was about 50 miles north of Hebron. When he doesn't find his brothers at Shechem, Joseph goes to Dothan, a location 15 miles north of Shechem. Verses 18 to 22. When Joseph finds his brothers, there is a shift in perspective. Suddenly the story is told from his brother's point of view. Reuben, who advocates for Joseph's life, is the firstborn and the decision maker of the family in verses 21 to 24. He is apparently not part of the family group that was plotting to kill Joseph. That group consisted probably of Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, the four sons against whom Joseph brought a bad report in verse 2. How readily does Joseph wait his father's orders. Those children who are best beloved by their parents should be the most ready to obey them. See how deliberate Joseph's brothers were against him. They thought to kill him, premeditated, and in cold blood. Whomsoever hates his brother or sister is a murderer, as it is said in 1 John 3 verse 15. They hated him because their father loved him and feared he would rule over them and they would worship him. New occasions at his dreams and the like drew them on further. But these laid a festering wound in their hearts till they resolved on his death. Yahweh has all hearts in his hands. Reuben had most reason to be jealous of Joseph, for he was the firstborn. Yet he proves to be his best friend. Yahweh overruled all to serve his own purpose of making Joseph an instrument to save much people. Joseph was a type of grass, for though he was the beloved son of his father and hated by a wicked world, yet the Father sent him out of his bosom to visit us in great humility and love. He came from heaven to earth to seek and save us. Yet then malicious plots were laid against him by his own Jewish people. His own not only did not receive him, but crucified him. This he submitted to as a part of his design. Genesis 37 verses 23 to 30, Joseph's brothers sell him. verses 23 to 28. These verses record how the brothers captured Joseph and subsequently sell him to the Midianite merchants for 20 pieces of silver. Slave trading was common in Egypt. The price agreed on for Joseph was the same price that was later specified for a slave between the ages of 5 to 20 years under the Mosaic economy, as we see it in Leviticus 27 verse 5. Verses 29 to 32. When Reuben returns to find Joseph gone, he knows that as the oldest, he will have to answer to his father for whatever has happened. Then thus evolves the brothers' scheme. Though the brothers never actually say Joseph is dead, they successfully deceived their father, who also in his youth has deceived his brother Esau twice. They threw Joseph into a pit to perish there with hunger and cold. So cruel were their tender mercies. They slighted him when he was in distress, and they were not grieved for the affection of Joseph, as it is said in Amos 6 verse 6. For when he was pining in the pit, they sat down to eat bread. They felt no remorse of conscience for the sin, but the wrath of man shall praise Yahweh, and the remainder of wrath he will restrain, as it is said in Psalm 76 verse 10. Joseph's brothers were wonderfully restrained from murdering him, and their selling him as wonderfully turned to Yahweh's praise. Genesis 37 verses 31 to 36, Jacob deceived Joseph, sold to Potiphar. Verse 36, Joseph ends in Egypt in the home of